All right. Good morning, everybody. This is Christian Baldwin with Black Diamond Mergers and Acquisitions, joined today by two of my close colleagues and friends, B.R. Price to my left. He's an attorney with Reese-Moore Pendergraft, and Jeremy Forbis, CFP with Anchorpoint Financial. And we're going to talk today a little bit about partnerships. And the title, of course, is What's a Ship Guaranteed to Sink? And, of course, a partnership. And not all partnerships are destined for failure, but at some point they will transition either in the form of selling a business or just bringing another partner on, or death or disability and things like that. And so we're going to sort of kick around a few different topics today, and I will facilitate this. The format of this webinar is 30 minutes of good discussion, and then we'll open it up for 15 minutes of Q&A, and we'll have people that are rolling in, and it looks like there's some that are in the waiting room now, maybe, that need to be admitted. So we'll deal with that. But let me just turn over to you guys briefly. Jeremy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Jeremy Forbis. I'm a CFP, an AIF, accredited investment fiduciary, and so I'm with Anchorpoint Financial. Been in the business since January 2001, and so I guess our have dealt with buy-sell agreements and partnerships and things of that nature ever since the beginning. So it's part of what we do.
Yeah.
B.R. Price, my attorney, R&P. Most of my practice is transactional practice, so people buying and selling businesses, forming businesses, mergers, acquisition type work, and then some estate planning and closely held businesses. A lot of times that stuff goes together. So yeah, a lot of experience on this topic.
So BR, let's start with you maybe. What are some of the foundational elements, right, that need to go into the formation of a partnership when you're putting these things together, like operating agreements or buy-sell agreements, things like that? What are some of the things that you want to make sure you walk through those clients that are interested in forming one to start with?
Sure, yeah. And kind of one of the initial steps is what type of entity you want to form, whether it's just a simple partnership, a limited partnership, a limited liability company, or corporation. And the factors that go into that are numerous. Some of them will be tax considerations. Some of them are operational considerations, what type of business it's going to be. But yeah, getting that kind of that structure initially, and then the governing documents of how it's all going to work together from an operational standpoint, but also from if we're planning on bringing on more partners, or we're planning on raising money for growth and things like that, which structure makes that easier, and making sure your governing documents address those sort of things, as well as a partner wanting to leave, or something happens to someone, whether it's death or disability. All that stuff needs to be kind of considered on the front end, because if it's not, it usually becomes a mess on the back end when it's time for those things to happen.
And from your perspective, Jeremy, how do you identify those risk elements, I guess we could call it, in those partnerships? And what are some ways that you can shift those to insurance to help mitigate some of that?
Well, I think that, just with respect to these agreements, and we're really involved in the funding aspect of that. I mean, we might start at the beginning of the planning process and get them to someone like BR, who's an expert in the actual legal documents. But there's an opportunity to transfer risk in several areas, in business and personal planning, and this is one of those areas, because as the title alludes to, we don't like to think about it when we start a marriage or a partnership, that we don't like to think about the end. We like to think about the beginning and all the success we're going to have. But ultimately, there will be a change at some point. And so it's not required, but it would make sense in most cases to think about the funding of each of these scenarios that might cause, in this case, a partnership to come to an end. So that's where we're involved, evaluating those options and helping to bring to the table those options. And and help guide the client through that decision.
Guys, does it matter how many partners are involved in a partnership?
I mean, it does to a certain extent, obviously, because depending on the ownership structure, a lot of times these things are set up to where, kind of it's a majority rule, so to speak. So if you get to the point where it's a 50-50, or you've got multiple partners that no one owns a majority, then the day-to-day decisions and that sort of thing need to be fleshed out a little more of how that's going to work, whether it's, it takes 2/3 or that sort of thing to make a decision. And then, as far as, the minority interest holders, depending on how all that's structured, they may not have a lot of say, and that may be fine, but it may not as well. So those are, the more people get involved, obviously, the more complicated those discussions tend to be. But yeah, again, that's stuff to hopefully flesh out on the front end. You can't account for every possible scenario, but we can account for a lot of them.
Some of those that we're probably familiar with are what happens when one partner desires to sell his or her membership interest, assuming it's an LLC, to another partner, or what provisions might be in there if they want to go outside the partnership and sell those membership units, and then what approval is necessary for the remaining partners. Death, what happens if someone dies? What happens if someone's disabled and their level of control and that sort of thing? Do you guys have any examples of maybe a situation where it wasn't really handled right on the front end and there was a poor outcome, and then maybe an example where it was handled correctly on the front end and then it had a good outcome?
You want to go first? I mean, there's lots of examples where it ends poorly, and unfortunately, that can be to the detriment of not only the business, its customers, its customer base, its client base, who they serve, but also all the families represented by the owners, both the potential buyer and seller. So I think I don't have one specifically that comes to mind where it's bad, but it's not good if you don't have a plan in place and things aren't things aren't clearly spelled out as to how it's going to work from the beginning. You have one?
Yeah, I've got one that pops into mind. I'm kind of in the middle of right now that involves a partnership, and one of the partners, owners that's been a long time owner, is the majority owner, has lost capacity. So he's got kids that are powers of attorney that are trying to get in on things, and from a shareholder member perspective, that's not that big of a deal. But in a closely held entity, usually your shareholders are also operating and running the company. So
just to be clear, you say lost capacity, like mental or ability?
Mental.
So maybe, does that mean disabled possibly?
Yeah. So
okay, just want to make sure.
So yeah, a lot of times there's like a disability, and that's where a lot of stuff, and they don't have anything built into their governing documents that say, okay, when a member loses capacity, or when an officer loses capacity or whatever, this is what happens.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're trying to work through all that, and it's become a lot more complicated than it really needed to be if they'd have had all that stuff kind of fleshed out on the front end, even just some generic standard language that didn't have.
And that's the thing I see that's most often not addressed, is the ability to not work, right? I mean, often, if someone passes away, or if it's, a split because somebody quits or wants to retire, that's often addressed. But I mean, there's been a lot of times where I don't even see that addressed, much less funded, so. Yeah,
and I think also is just the understanding of the difference between, okay, you're an owner, but you're also maybe an employee or an officer of the entity. The way those things work are two different. That's two separate things. You can own the company and not work there anymore, but then the partners who remain sometimes get resentful because, okay, I'm 50% owner, I'm doing all the work. Yep. This other person's 50% owner, they're not doing anything, and they're still getting half of the.
Yep.
So just things like that can be addressed on the front end that make it a lot easier to, yeah, whether it's a, a particular event that causes the other partner to have the option to buy out, or, something like that, or it's funded in a different way to where it's not just going to cripple the company to be able to do it. So,
and then on those agreements, can I ask a question? Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
On those agreements, do you see that it's important to get pretty granular about that incapacity issue, or about the inability to work? I mean, because at some level, you may want to have a length of time in which you allow that to resolve itself one way or another. You got to get pretty specific.
We'll see it addressed in certain ways. Sometimes it's okay if you're unable to work for a period of time.
Yeah.
Agreed upon amount of time, and it's basically de facto disability, incapacity. Other times you'll see it in there where it's a, if there's a, doctor's note or whatever that basically says, hey, they're not able to handle their affairs anymore, or something like that. That gets a little touchy because of it's a personal thing as well. So I think a lot of times people like to default to the, hey, if you're not able to work for 6 months, I don't really need to know the nuts and bolts of it. But if you can't be here, then there's a, an option to purchase that pops up or something like that.
Yeah.
What's the difference in a buy-sell agreement and then the normal contents that you would find in a shareholder agreement or an operating agreement? And when would you guys recommend that a buy-sell agreement is put in place?
Generally, we'll see a buy-sell agreements. The vast majority of the time, they're going to be funded by like a insurance policy or life insurance, that sort. A lot of times I see those deal with death a lot. But you can have that sort of thing in the operating agreement or whatever your governing document is. But yeah, I mean, sometimes you'll see it in the form of, an option to purchase if a certain event happens, death being one of them a lot of times. But depending on the size of the business and the value and all that stuff, it may not be a feasible thing for for a partner to buy the family out of whoever passed away or something like that. Have something else in place. And that's usually where the life insurance policy comes into play a lot.
But the operating agreement should always specify what then versus like a buy-sell agreement being a separate document, or is it?
Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of times if there's going to be insurance involved, there'll be a buy-sell, a separate agreement in that. If it's just hey, here's how we're going to calculate the value of the shares, and that triggering event happens, we're going to get an appraisal, or every year we're going to agree to a value of the company each year, and then if something happens during that next year, that's what we're going to base the valuation off of. And I'll even see it sometimes where they'll put in there, it can be paid out over time. Essentially, we're creating loan terms within the operating agreement. So yeah, I mean, you can get pretty granular, like you said, in there in that regard as well, which the more detail, the better. I think, the less gray area, the better on stuff like that, where you can just look at a document and say, clearly, this is what's supposed to happen.
Yeah.
Not going to eliminate fights. People can argue over pretty minute details, but at least it's the concept is pretty well fleshed out.
Well, and as thinking through this today, I was thinking about times in my work experience where if there was a disagreement amongst partners, I've seen going to that operating agreement, that buy-sell agreement, where you have an agreed upon deal, what the situation is. Whether it be a formula, you can refer to that and say, is this a hill I'm willing to die on? Not physically triggering life insurance, but is this something? Yeah.
I don't think they pay out.
Right. But is this something that I can't get over, or can I yield to this? Because if I have an agreement and I know how I can be bought out, for example, then I can say, okay, this is something that's really important to me, and I'm willing to trigger this event, or I'm not. And I've seen that be really helpful to people as they navigate.
Yeah, and sometimes people, they'll do all that work on the front end, but it's 10 years later and they haven't really looked at that portion of the operating agreement or whatever, and they may get a little aggravated and start thinking about that sort of thing. And then like you said, they look at the agreement like, I don't really like what that says I have to do to do this. I'm not as mad as I thought I was, or that sort of thing. Also, I've seen build provisions in there just as a, if they just can't get along anymore, it's basically to say, hey, you can offer to buy someone out, but if you make that offer, they have the ability to say, I'm not going to sell to you, but I'm going to buy you out on the same terms you just offered to me.
Yeah.
So it's basically like a, I won't say a shotgun wedding, but more like a shotgun divorce, where it's like, it's going to be over when you pull that, when you pull that card. It's just a matter of, that way you're not going to lowball anybody, because you know they can just turn around and do the same thing on you. So it's a kind of a, you know, the poison pill, so to speak, that ends it. And some people like to have that in there, some don't. But
yeah, and we were just dealing with one recently that was a medical practice, and that situation got really hairy because one of the partners has that in place. They have their operating agreement and an additional buy-sell agreement. However, it gets tricky in how he thought about it, because if he is the one that ends up, he would prefer to sell, but if he ends up being the buyer because of that reverse triggering event, then they have to figure out where all the patient's going to go, because those are, you know, personal relationships and whatnot. And so he decided not to do anything right now, was where he kind of ended up on that one.
A lot of times in those service type businesses where the owners are actively, you know, running the company, there's a little bit different dynamic there, because there may be one that, you know, is driving the business, whether they have all the relationships or that sort of thing. And so it doesn't really make, without them, it's not going to go one way or the other. The other partner may have put money in on the front end and, you know, be a part of it, but they're business essentially. And so those are other dynamics that come into play.
You mentioned reviewing this, you know, all this information, right, at some periodic frequency. How often do you recommend to your clients that they review these documents and their situation?
Every time you change your air filter. I think it's
some people that would be very much.
Right. Yeah, we need to do both more often than we do, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. It came to mind earlier that, you know, in what I do, we often talk about financial planning being a process. So if maybe that's every year, you know, I mean, but especially if you had a fixed price, I mean, I know that's an option, but I don't know when that would make sense, quite honestly, you know, I mean, so if you're going to use a fixed price as an evaluation method, you better change it pretty frequently.
Yeah. And that we don't see that as much, maybe. You know, I think the most common we see is, let's say you and I are partners in the business. You go get an independent third party. I'll go get an independent third party. And if those two can't agree, then they go get another one, and we just do an average of 3.
Yeah.
You know, that's pretty common. But what would you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, so there's, you know, you don't want to give people too much work to do on the operating agreement. So if it's like, okay, start putting stuff in there that says every year we're going to have a meeting, we're going to determine these things. They might do it the first year, but let's be honest, probably the second, third, fourth, fifth year, it's not gonna happen. And so then usually if we do have something like that in there, we just have a kind of a catch-all that says, hey, if they haven't done it, we resort back to the go get third-party appraisals or something like that.
Right.
Just to where there's a kind of a safety net, so we aren't left with just trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
I shouldn't be surprised anymore, but we've seen so many times where partners, you know, they're doing a million things, right? And they're running the business and whatever it is that their individual situation is, and they sell some or part to the other person, and it's not documented correctly. I mean, I can't tell you how many times we've seen that. Because we'll say, okay, we're going to sell this whole entity, right? Well, who owns what? And they'll say, well, I own 75 and he owns 25. Okay, but all your documents say you're still 50-50. Oh yeah, well, I bought 25% from him, 5 years ago. Show us that so we can have that documentation, and it may or may not exist. And then if it's you go to the tax return and see if that jobs, and it may or may not. It's amazing. So when you have something like that, how do you go back and fix all that?
Yeah, I mean, documenting it obviously as it happens is the best way to go. But
you ever seen that
requests all their documents and they're trying to figure out guarantors and that sort of thing, and they look at the documents and are like, this doesn't match up with what you told me, or B, they're trying to sell. So it's basically any kind of a transactional thing where you get somebody kind of digging in to make sure, you know, who's signing has authority, that sort of thing is when it pops up on the back end. And so, yeah, I mean, obviously you can document those things, but it's better to do it when it happens, because otherwise, usually it's a scramble job whenever it pops up in those scenarios. And, you know, someone's recollection may not be quite the same as the others. If it's not, we don't have a signed piece of paper. So.
Right. And yeah, and it can get even more complicated when they're paying out different ratios or distributions that don't match, you know, their percent ownership and what sort of that kind of thing. We won't get into all that. But Jeremy, question for you. So there's insurance you can get to protect against disability and life. Get that. What about like business overhead insurance and things like that? Yeah. Where did those products fit into the situation?
Well, I mean, anytime you have a business owner, you have the personal checkbook and then, you know, the business. So they might want to protect income for their household. But in the event of their disability, they might also want to make sure that the business can continue to run while they're not there, that the employees are paid, that the rent's paid. That's what business overhead expense is. So, you know, if that's an important aspect, and it often is, because some disabilities are temporary. Many last less than 5 years. The majority of them last less than 5 years. And that can be as a result of an injury or an illness. But so business overhead is important. You know, the personal income is important, you know, just ask the family. So, and then there's also, I mean, there is buy-sell funding for the agreement, right? So we've already talked about, it's often overlooked that the disability or incapacity be something that should be in an agreement, because it can happen. Especially I'm thinking about with the aging, you know, population, many of which are business owners. That incapacity issue may be something we see more often. But so that if the disability is the triggering event, it is something that can be funded through insurance. So those are all the aspects of disability. Disability is interesting. It's a little more complex than life insurance. You're either dead or you're not. It's pretty easy to determine. But so when you're looking at a contract, you want to make sure that the definition of disability matches what you want. And so the better the definition, the stronger the language, the more expensive it's going to be generally. But that can be really important if somebody specializes. Somebody's highly educated and specialized, used a medical professional example earlier. So that's typically an area where you would want the best language that you could get. If you could think about like a doctor, for example, is it going to pay if they can no longer be a surgeon? Or is it going to make them, you know, be a doctor and do regular rounds? Well, there's a big income gap there, right? And it might make a big difference to the business as well. If all of a sudden the surgeon has to become, you know, if there's a partnership involved there. So there's lots of areas of disability. It's not as clear cut as you know, death, as life insurance, but it can be funded for each of those areas, because that income is important to the person, the business, and can kind of impact the ongoing operation of the business as well, which is kind of what we're talking about today.
It's all right. Anything to add? What other factors would we need to consider when you think about insurance as a mechanism to try to help with some of these challenges and partnerships? Like when you sit down with a business owner, you say, okay, here are all the things you need to consider. What are some of those things?
Well, I think you got to consider anytime you insure something, if that's a risk you want to bear yourself, or if you want to transfer that risk. You know, we're required, I guess, by law to have some level of insurance on our vehicle, right? But it's also an asset. So I get to determine whether I want to do something above what's required by law, and I want to protect that asset. You know, our income to our business and ultimately to our family is our most valuable asset. So without it, the car, everything else that we insure, everything else that our family and our business depends on goes away. So we don't often think about our income as being our most valuable asset. but it is, because without it, everything else goes away. So is that helpful? Does that kind of answer that?
Yeah, and I think, yeah, just the scenarios of, like you say, death or disability, where it's partners, the sole source of income for their family or that sort of thing. They're also important to the business.
Yeah.
So you've got their, spouse out there that obviously want to help out. So there's, insurance that covers that sort of thing, whether it's through a buy sell or something like that.
Right.
But there's also, insurance for the company that's gonna pay out to keep the company going as
Right.
well. And they work together, but they're not the same thing.
Well, and how do you fulfill the obligation of that remaining spouse, right? That remaining family, even if they're not married. How do you be done with that deceased or disabled partner's ownership right? I mean, you either self-fund it or you transfer that risk. And it's not that it has to be insured, everything has to be insured all the time. You just make an educated decision about that. I mean, if it's $1 million or $10 million that's due, within 30 days after a death, for example, unless your partner is Bill Gates, a lot of people would want to offload some of that risk. And so that's how we look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the size and the value of the business.
Sure. Sure. Absolutely.
To win that. And that's different for different people. I would say it's a risk tolerance more than anything.
And it has to be looked at over time, right? So, is it a tiny business and it's not worth much? Maybe we don't need to transfer that risk. Does that business 10 years later, 5 years later become really valuable? Are the formulas used and the agreement still accurate? And if we follow those now, are they, is that a much bigger number than we once recognized when we started this business? And do we just have to identify the funding for that,
Yeah, and I think that's why it is worth revisiting, annually, every couple of years, something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't have to be all the time, but
no.
Letting it sit until the time comes when you have to, oh yeah, this is happening. Let's see what the agreement says. That's probably too late.
Yeah.
So most of what we talked about so far is when an event happens or someone's buying someone else out or something like that. BR, does it make any difference, or what would the differences be if the corporation or the entity itself is purchasing units back into treasury from an individual? Does that matter here, or is it basically the same type of setup?
Kind of similar, and usually that's addressed in the agreement as well, is to say, in some of these events, they'll provide in there that the company has essentially the first, option to purchase or buy it back. And then if they don't, then the remaining members or shareholders can purchase, a pro rata amount if they want to. But if one of them says they don't, the others can buy whatever they want. So it's usually a kind of a tiered, like the company can buy it back first. If the company decides it doesn't want to or it can't, then the other members or stockholders, can equally buy a share to keep their amounts in the same ratios as they would have been. And then if one or more of them doesn't want to, then the others can buy what they want.
Okay. What next steps, or where should people go to get more information? Like, what do you recommend people do that are business owners as they kind of try to figure out, okay, one situation might be, I don't really know what I've got, or maybe I need to start from scratch, or maybe I don't like what I've got written and I need to do something about it, or maybe I've thought about this risk and it's time to shift that to an insurance or something. How do you get started? Where do you
go? A lot of times from my end, obviously you get a lot of folks that'll come and they're, wanting to start a business, and there's nothing there yet. And we're starting from scratch on the entity, and there may be partners, there may not be. And so that obviously we're trying to get it as kind of neatly tied up as we can on the front end. You also get those where it's like, okay, set up this LLC 15 years ago and it was just me. And now we've brought on these other owners. We haven't really documented stuff. Don't have an operating agreement, that sort of thing. And then we're dealing with everybody at that point. It's kind of like, okay, well, how are you running this? How do you want it to run going forward? So yeah, every stage imaginable, or somebody's getting ready to retire and they want to revisit it, change some stuff, or so that sort of thing. Most of your, like operating agreements and stuff in LLCs are you know, a living document that can be changed as long as majority of the members or whatever agree to the change. So yeah, I mean, that's why it's worth revisiting every once in a while, is to just say, does this really make sense for how we're operating now?
I've got a question that came to mind as you were talking about. You see many, we're talking about partnerships. What if you have a sole owner? You see very many sole owners implement, you know, a key person to be that buyer and kind of have a buy sell with a key employee there.
A key employee.
Yeah, that would, you know.
I do on occasion, and a lot of times I'll see it in kind of similar, like service industries, or like even in your business, you know, if you got somebody that works for you that's licensed and has been there a while, it just makes sense that they would be the one to buy it out if they wanted to. Or yeah, I see it in insurance. I see that sort of thing. Anything where there's somebody who's kind of, you know, a right-hand person or whatever, that's seems to be the logical choice to buy it. I've seen that where, you know, as an incentive to continue working there, you know, kind of like in sports, they have like a coach in waiting kind of thing. It's almost, it's that kind of scenario where it's like, okay, I'm going to retire in 10 years. I want you to have the opportunity to take this business over. Let's figure out an agreement right now to where that happens.
Right.
Yeah. Great. Thank you guys so much.